This country is filled with wonderful cottage gardens, and before starting to build mine at Barnsdale, I visited some of them to see what lessons I could learn. Gardens made by experts with years of experience could, I suppose, be a bit daunting for first-time gardeners. But that's the beauty of cottage gardening, and this has been proved over the centuries, that you can actually do it as you go along without any experience at all and still finish up with a beautiful garden. We found a young gardener just outside Peterborough who had started reluctantly and out of sheer necessity.
It was a totally boring rectangle with a concrete path right up the middle. Not a lot to recommend it really. It was also very, very overgrown, and we didn't even own a lawnmower at that time. Basically, it was just another space to be tidied, and so that's what I did.
So how did you get started on this sort of project?
Well, neighbours gave me some plants that when they were splitting up the herbaceous perennials, they gave me a few bits, and I thought I've got to put them somewhere. So I dug out one border, and that was it. I thought, it looks like a real garden, so carried on from there. Just evolved, and I liked what was happening. So the grass got smaller and the borders got bigger.
But you've planted it absolutely beautifully. You must have had some sort of idea of what you were doing, of where you were going to put plants.
Well, not really. It was just by eye. I got things given, or I bought things, and I put them where they looked good. And if they grew there and they were happy, that was fine. All fairly easy things. I like the hardy and very easy things.
And at that stage, did you know very much about gardening?
Nothing at all.
So how did you learn?
Well, I've watched television programmes, I've bought quite a lot of books, and I've learned by accident, really. It's just happened. Just
like Yvonne, the old cottage gardeners were inspired by a love of plants. Their gardens were cheap and cheerful, and following that tradition, I've built a completely do-it-yourself garden on a very tight budget, which I've called the Artisan's Garden. But later on, the cottage style was adopted by wealthier people. So I've made a second garden, this time sparing no expense. The gentleman's cottage garden. In this week's programme, I shall begin building, starting with the boundaries and then the basic structure, the borders, the paths, and the plants used to grow over and soften them. Well, when you start a new garden, the first thing to think about is the boundary. And the old cottage gardeners would have used a hedge, probably of quickthorn. And they would have grown plants through it like wild roses and clematis and made a very beautiful site. Later, the wealthier Victorian cottage gardeners used plants like yew, and that's what I've chosen for my gentleman's cottage garden. I've used quite large container-grown plants and fed them with just a little bone meal. Firming and a good watering will see them well on their way. The trouble is that for today's small gardens, a hedge can take up too much space. For that reason, I've decided to use a fence around my artisan's garden. But at least it is only 2 inches wide. Now, when these panels are first put up, they are a pretty ghastly orange colour, though they do fade a bit. But they're still a far cry from the cottage garden hedge. But there are alternatives. At least we can make our fence the same colour as the cottage garden hedge, which in fact makes a much better background for plants. Now, you can buy panels that are already stained green, but it's a little bit too light for our purposes, so I'm staining this with a much darker green wood stain. But if you want your roses and your clematis to twine through your artificial hedge, then you've got to provide them with the same sort of twiggy support that the quickthorn will give them. And you do that with wires. Make sure that first staple's in really firmly, or it could be dangerous. Now when you get to the end, the first job is to put your staple in at the right height, but don't drive it right home. And then you can cut off the wire a little bit longer than you actually need it. Out there. Poke it through the staple. Straining the wire tight is a fine art. Get a bit of old but strong wood, wrap the wire round it with the wood close to the post, and then you can strain it like that and get it really tight, and then of course hammer the staple home. Now cut the excess off at the end, and then just wrap it round itself, like that. And then you need one staple in at each post, and the job's done. And by the summer, the plants had grown up, twined around my artificial twiggy supports, and created as beautiful a boundary as a real cottage garden hedge. Panel fencing will of course give you privacy, but if you're in a situation where you don't need it, and particularly if you've got a view that you don't want to hide, then there's no better alternative than the genuine cottage garden article, the picket fence. You can also buy these in sections, and they're very easy to erect, and with cottage flowers planted either side, they look marvellous. If you can pinch a little bit of land in front of the picket fence, or even set it back a bit, you can create a marvellous effect. Of course, if your garden borders on the footpath or the road, then you must grow plants here that will put up with exhaust fumes and the attentions of passers-by, to say nothing of dogs. And the old-fashioned annuals really fit the bill. Of course, these are perfectly hardy, so they're very easy to raise from seed and very cheap too. In the early spring, all you have to do is to scratch a few drills, sow the seed into them, cover them up with your hand, and away they go. And what marvellous plants they are. There can't be anything easier to grow than the good old nasturtium. Like all the hardy annuals, it thrives on poor soil, and it'll flower its heart out right the way through the summer. Another old-fashioned favourite is the poached eggplant, and that one is a very good attractor of insects into the garden. Now this one is a bit of a newer introduction, but it's just as easy to grow. It's a poppy called ladybird, and it's not difficult to see why. The English marigold has been around forever, and once you've got this in your borders, it'll obligingly seed itself all over the place without ever becoming a nuisance. And many hardy annuals will do this, but bear in mind that you can collect the seed yourself from all of them and sow it where you want it. That's what I do with those Iceland poppies. Now they're actually perennials, but I grow them as hardy annuals. Now, the sweet peas too are hardy annuals, and they can be sown in exactly the same way direct outside. But I raise mine in pots in the cold frame simply because that way you get an earlier show. And for flowers like these, I find it hard to wait. If you have a wall or a strong fence, you could cover it with roses to create a stupendous effect. These, I discovered, were grown in a quite surprising way.
Well, these are rambling roses. They're naturally pendular in habit. And what we decided to do was to make it more exciting by planting the rose on the other side so it would come up and flow over.
Oh, I see that.
And so you don't get the unsightly bare stem of the rose at the base of the wall on the other side.
What are the varieties you're using?
Well, we've used Albrecht Barbier here because it goes on flowering nearly all the summer. And beyond it, Wedding Day. And they're very nice colours, they work together very well.
After creating my version of a cottage garden hedge, my next job in the artisan's garden was to lay out the basic structure, the paths and the beds. As I pointed out last week, my design is very simple. Quite often, path edgings were elaborate. But the budget for our artisan's garden is very tight, so I'm using timber. This is 75 by 25 millimetre softwood, and I've had it pressure treated with preservative so it should last for life. And I've also painted it dark green to match the fencing. But before I can edge the paths, I've got to set them out. Now the central path runs straight down the middle of the garden, so it's a good idea to set up a datum line which actually cuts the garden right in half, and then you can measure everything from that. The central path is 3 foot wide, so if we measure 18 inches from there, that's the place to put the first line. The edgings are laid more or less on top of the soil because by the time you've dug the borders, it'll rise at least 10 centimetres. The edging's held by nailing it onto pegs made of the same material and about 30 centimetres long. You'll need one peg about every metre and a half, and make sure that it's perfectly true by checking it with the spirit level before you nail it onto the second peg. Oh, that didn't take long. Now all that remains is just to colour the cut ends with a little bit of the wood stain. Don't worry that these cut ends are going to let the water in, by the way, to rot the wood, because bear in mind that they're all pressure treated with preservative and the stain is only a colouring. Cottage gardeners can't afford to be too fussy about paths. Just level the soil, tread it down firmly and cover it with a layer of pea shingle. It makes a very serviceable path very cheaply. It will, however, leave you with straight, hard edges, which are not really in keeping with the cottagey feel. But with some careful planning, within a couple of months you can begin to see how the plants are tumbling out from the borders onto the paths and softening those hard edges. This anthermis is a great favourite of mine, with lovely chalk white daisies and this superb silver foliage. And if you cut those daisies back when they finish flowering, the foliage remains attractive right the way through the season. Over here there are a couple of geums which are just beginning to tumble over the edge, and the garden pinks down here which are newly planted but will soon fall over the edges too. The aubrietia here has really finished, and that's got to be cut back very shortly, but that'll soon be replaced by another anthermis, but this time with green foliage and bright golden flowers. And now we've got a couple of spaces down here, so I'm going to plant some more to tumble over the edge. This one is a real traditional old cottage garden plant. It's called bouncing bet or saponaria, And that will go in there and make a beautiful cushion of these deep pink flowers. And near to it, I'm planting a plant that the old cottage gardeners certainly wouldn't have known. This is a diacia, and that too has a mound-forming habit and will produce lovely deep pink flowers. There are other materials that I could have used for the path in my artisan's garden, which are cheap and equally successful. With a bark path like this, you can even dispense with the edging. And old bricks look wonderful too, especially if plants are allowed to spread around and in between them.
So we potter through and...
I do like your paths here, Mark. I mean, did you do these yourself?
Yes.
Where did the
we laid
bricks
them.
come from?
They were all lying about somewhere. I suppose they had been used for other buildings.
Do you find that you get problems with flaking? Because these are obviously wall bricks,
Yes,
aren't they?
I have to replace a certain number every year.
Do you find that that you get a lot of weed seeding into it?
Yes, they're wonderful conditions for seeding.
But you also get plants
There's
seeding.
some wonderful natural seeding, which we encourage.
You've got plants which grow over the edges too. Now, what sort of things do you use there?
Well, I think they almost tend to happen more than we use them, but I mean, the ajugas obviously spread well. There's
This
blue,
bugle,
the
yeah,
blue
it's
one, and there's a
lovely.
nice pink form over there, which for some unknown reason is called purple torch. And the dianthus, of course, the old cottage pinks.
And what's that?
It's a little variegated London pride.
In the gentleman's cottage garden, I could afford to go to town, so I decided to use special brick pavias. First, I set up a wooden edging, in the same way that I did for the gravel paths. Then, to make a solid base, I used a dry mix of ballast and cement, which was consolidated again with the well-worn boots. A layer of builder's sand goes on top, and that's raked roughly level and once more trodden down. Then it's finally levelled with a notched board to ensure that it's at the right height for the bricks. They can be laid out in a variety of patterns. They're quite easy to cut with a hammer and brick bolster. Then cover the lot with kiln-dried sand. You can get it from the builders' merchants. You can bash them down with a wide board and a fencing post, but the easy way is to spread out a bit of old carpet, hire a vibrating pad, and just run it up and down. Put on a bit more sand, brush it off, and the path looks great. Where the paths crossed, I planned a circular area, so I started by setting the outside circle of bricks, and then I sunk a flower pot in the middle. Well, with all the bricks now down and sand brushed into the joints, the circle's beginning to look quite nice. And now it's time for the finishing touches. And I can reveal what this flower pot in the middle is for. It's a bit like those Russian dolls, really, that fit inside each other. And what we do is to put the next size flower pot down inside this one. There's a little bit of sand in the bottom just to make sure that they finish up exactly level at the top, and that does take a little bit of fiddling about, but in the end it looks rather nice. And the final pot can be just planted up with a plant of thyme, and that will eventually spread out just enough to break those hard lines. I've left planting holes in the brick circle, which I filled with equal parts of soil, garden compost and coarse grit, because the thymes which I've planted there like a very well-drained compost. The edges of this path have been softened by planting box hedging. Very formal, of course, but with a very informal planting behind. The two go well together. And the hard texture of the brick paving has been further softened by using containers. All kinds of pots give you the opportunity to be adventurous and original with your planting. This one is filled with a mixture of tender perennials, like osteospermums, geraniums, marguerites and diacias. And every cottage garden I visited used pots filled with seasonal flowers. Good preparation of the borders will really pay dividends later on. So when you dig, work in plenty of manure, spent mushroom compost, or one of the alternatives. From the earliest times, cottage gardeners have known the importance of keeping their soil highly fertile.
Most cottage gardens kept a pig, and this pig was kept for food, of course. All the dung from the animal and the straw was all dug into the cottage garden, quite an important part of the fertility. The privy at the bottom of the garden was also a very important part of that. This was cleaned out on a regular basis.
Well, of course, they looked upon night soil, as they called it, really very much as a resource rather than a waste product, didn't they?
Oh, indeed.
They had some very peculiar ways of collecting it.
Yes, a classic example is here at the Open Air Museum, where there's an upstairs privy and, of course, a hole cut into the floorboards and a pit some 10 foot below it. Now, of course, all the waste from there went into the pit, along with probably the ashes from the wood fire, probably waste material from the kitchens, vegetable waste and so on and so forth, all mixed in, trenches dug in the garden, and it emptied in on a regular basis, and this was one of their main sources of garden fertility.
No one seems to use night soil anymore, but I found that to some cottage gardeners, manure was still as important as ever.
I have that farmyard manure, and I think that's the best stuff to put in the garden.
What sort of muck is it?
Big muck from the farm where I used to work. Well, I've done 52 years with them, you see, the same farm.
Yeah. The soil type will mainly dictate what needs to be added.
The initial thing was firstly to put in plenty of well-rotted manure, masses of it, more than is really recommended. And that is because the soil here is extremely dry. It's right by the river, very silty, and as I say, it's got no guts in it at all.
And you don't use fertiliser at all?
Very rarely, because the soil is poor, that I don't think it's going to do the plants much good to put too much fertiliser on. I'd rather spend money on plants and let the plants get used to the soil conditions I've got.
Others agree that it's important to grow plants that will suit the soil.
We normally get about the same rainfall as Jerusalem, that is about 20 inches, which is little enough, but in drought years that goes down to about 16. And here we're on gravel soil, which acts just like a giant colander. Although the surface may get wet, in actual fact, down at the bottom, about a foot down, it's just dust. So you have to find plants that will deal with that, and a lot of plants will not. I put on lots and lots of leaf mould. I've ceased to put manure on the garden because I find it promotes a sort of fleshy growth, and then the plants are even less able to take the drought in their stride. So that I think it's best to grow them as hard as possible, but just improve the soil a bit.
Sometimes it is possible to change the soil to suit the plants. Mine is heavy clay, but that wasn't going to stop me growing one of the great cottage garden favourites. It's extremely difficult to grow good pinks on heavy clay soil like mine. They must have a good bit of drainage, so you've got to improve it in some way. Well, I use my magic mix, which is a mixture of equal parts of garden compost, or you could use spent mushroom compost just as well, and coarse grit, and a little bit of organic fertiliser thrown in. And of course, raising the beds too actually improves the drainage as well. Now, the old cottage gardeners used to grow some wonderful pinks, lovely dainty markings, and of course a very strong perfume too. But you know, we can even improve on those today. The trouble with them was that they only flowered once during the season, so the hybridists had a go at them, and they've produced a race of modern pinks. But many of them have actually lost their perfume, and some of them have lost those lovely markings too. So they've had another look, and they've now produced pinks which have the best of all worlds. They have the delicate markings, they have the heady perfume, and they'll flower right the way through the season. Things like Becky Robinson, which is a lovely pink with crimson markings. That's a double, and it has a superb perfume as well. And then there are varieties like Grand's Favourite, which is white with scarlet lacing on it, and again a superb perfume, and they'll flower on and off right through the season. Roses are, of course, obligatory in cottage gardens, and these, I think, say it all. This wonderful little gingerbread cottage in Rutland is about the prettiest I think I've seen, and the roses add that final touch that's perfectly in tune. But then it doesn't really matter what sort of house you live in, growing plants on the walls will always improve it. Next week we'll be looking at vertical structures and what to grow on them, from roses to clematis, wisteria to honeysuckle. When you grow upwards, the sky's the limit.